into an already too full life. And so sometimes what we need to do is actually make the space, as that's actually part of the action plan, is making the space to allow in whatever it is we intend, because too many of us just don't have the space in our lives for that. And that was, something I really did have to create the space. And I also had to look at how deathly afraid I was. I saw marriage as a cage on a very deep level. I saw it as a cage, and little did I know I was living in a cage. And when I met this man, he had the key that opened it. Who would have thought? I would have never thought. The affirmations is just the starting point. That's like going, okay, here's where the goal is. What really gives those affirmations power is the emotion we put behind it. So what's interesting is you start out the journey going, okay, let me start here. Step one is what's the affirmation? Step two is, how can I generate the emotional power behind that affirmation? And a lot of that comes from taking actions to support that affirmation. That's how you begin to step into that state. And then as you step into that state and you take actions and you put the emotional power behind those affirmations, they begin to manifest themselves in your life. Now you come full circle, and the opposite then becomes true or really it's just more full circle in that it's more about living in that powerful emotional state and the belief that all that I need is right here in this moment. Love truly is the most powerful force in the world. Abundance is our birthright and available to each and every one of us if it's part of our spiritual plan. And so it's living in that emotional and energetic state that is the sort of end. I don't know, it's probably not the end game. We'll see what happens next, right? But it's that way of being that you get to now live in as a result of the work you did early on, kind of installing those affirmations in your brain. I think of my brain as a computer. I've installed some great software. It plays in the background. I don't even know what it is anymore. I don't even hear the words, but I live in the state of those words as much as I possibly can, and I feel when I'm not living in that state.
This is Louise A. Hendricks interview, take one.
Can you check my focus real quick, please?
Sure. Then you.
Louise Hay film, Gay Hendricks interview, take two.
I was 24 years old, and I would say that everything that could possibly be wrong with my life was wrong. I weighed 120 pounds more than I weigh now, and I smoked 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and I was in a terrible relationship, and I had a job I hated, and so I couldn't think of much. Oh, I didn't like my car either. So I think just about everything was wrong. I'd always struggled with obesity. I was born, even by the end of my first year of life, I was very fat as a child, and I was taken around to different specialists and things because my mother and my brother were skinny, and so there was something going on there. And so by the time I was 24 years old, I weighed over 100 pounds, more than I weigh now. So I weighed 300 some pounds. And in addition, all this other stuff was going on too. And so I went out for a walk one afternoon. It was a winter in New England, and I was walking just kind of thinking about how am I going to get out of all of this? How am I going to get out of my life? And I stepped on a patch of ice that had some snow over it, and I didn't see the patch of ice, and I stepped on the patch of ice, and my feet shot out from under me, and I went whoomp down on the back of my head on the frozen road, and I hit myself just hard enough that it didn't knock me out. What it did was it kind of knocked me into a state of consciousness that was like nothing else I've ever experienced before. I was present, but I was also, something else was going on. I was kind of could see more than I could normally see inside myself. And I think I was laying on the ground for maybe 2 minutes or so. In this 2 minutes, I could see down through all the levels of myself. And I'd never been able to see this before. It was like, I saw why my muscles were tense. I saw that I had all of this fat around my body and my muscles were tense, and that all of the fat and the muscles tenseness was there because I had all of these feelings inside me that I had never opened up to, like all these things I was angry about that I'd never told anybody about, and all these things I was sad about that I'd never told anybody about, and things I was scared about. And it was like I could see the level of the meat, and then I could see down in the level of the emotion, and then I could see down underneath everything that there was this clear space that there was nothing kind of written on it. There was nothing there. It was kind of like a spiritual space or an open space with pure potential. And I saw that all of those feelings and all of that tension and all of that fat was there because I was living somebody else's life, basically. And that I wouldn't have that stuff if I had a different life. And what I mean by that is my father had died before I was born. He died while my mother was pregnant with me. And he was very obese, just like I was. He smoked heavily, had probably not a very good relationship with my mother. And I know they had a lot of struggles. And so he died in the midst of, while I was gestating. And so I never actually knew him in the world. But I had sort of taken on his life. That's what I could see down inside myself, that it wasn't even my life. And so it was an incredible moment. I think I'd never had anything like that because I always thought this was the reality. This was all there was, you know, and I'd never had a moment of awakening to spirit. And I think that, you know, the way I always say it is that if you're open, the universe will teach you by tickling you with a feather. But if you're not open, it has to hit you with a sledgehammer. Well, I was so closed that this was like getting hit by a sledgehammer. That was the only way I could learn what I needed to learn, I guess. And so I was in that altered state of consciousness for about 2 minutes, I think. And I began to come back to regular consciousness. I could feel my muscles kind of assembling their tension, and I could feel my awareness of all of this obesity around me. And I could still feel, though, that very sweet open space down in there, that sweet open spiritual space that didn't have anything on it. And as I was coming back to regular consciousness, I had these several thoughts that were very different from anything I'd ever thought. One thought was, I'm going to find out what I can do to feel that clear space all the time. And I thought, I'm going to do what I can to find out how to live that way, how to feel that all the time in my life. And the other thought I had was, I'm going to live my own life. I don't have to live my father's life or anybody's life. I can invent my own life. And if that's possible, how do I want it to be? And so as I was coming back to regular consciousness, I made a commitment to feeling that spiritual space all the time, and then to invent a healthy body, basically, and invent a great life. So I make this new commitment to, I really want to learn how to feel spirit all the time, just in ordinary life. And a friend of mine came over to my house one afternoon and said that one of his old Harvard professors had just come back from India and was giving a talk down the road about 30 miles at his father's house. And did I want to come and hear him? And I said, well, what's he talking about? And he said, well, he'd gone to India and he'd kind of gotten enlightened, and he was talking about yoga and meditation. And I thought, well, that sounds kind of interesting, you know, maybe I'll go. And so we go down there, and there is this guy in a robe, a white robe, and there's all these devotees around. I remember a girl came up and offered us fruit from a fruit bowl, you know, and I was thinking, what is this? You know, is this some cult or something? Well, it turned out to be Ram Dass, who was Neil's Harvard professor. Under those days, he was named Richard Alpert, and when Neil had taken his course at Harvard, and now he was named Ram Dass. And so Ram Dass had just come back from India, and he was just totally, you know, he was so blissed out and everything. And part of me related to it, but another part of me thought, what are these people selling? You know, like I was very cynical about that kind of thing at the time. And so I went up after the talk and asked Ram Dass, I said, look, I got to tell you, I'm very skeptical about this kind of stuff. This looks sort of insane to me, but since I'm here, I just had this experience where I fell on the ice, and I told him the experience. And I said, so I want to learn how to feel that clear feeling in me all the time, just in ordinary life. I felt it for a minute while I was sort of knocked out, but I'd like to feel it all the time without bashing my head on the ice. And I remember he looked up at me for a long time, and just sort of looked at me up and down. And he said, you should do some breathing exercises. And I said, breathing exercises? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? I never heard of anything like that. And he said, well, in India, if you have a problem, you might do some yoga around it or some breathing around it. And it's as valid a way as talking to a therapist about it. And so I said, well, where do you get something like this? And he said, well, just be open to it. It'll come to you. And I said, all right. And so the next day, I was down at the grocery store and in the checkout line. So I was, pushing my cart up through the checkout line, and they had a little kiosk of paperback books, a little round kiosk of paperback books. And I glanced down, and there is a book called Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation. I'll never forget this, by Jess Stern. And I can see the cover just like it's sitting right here now. And I remember looking at this, okay, Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation. All right, that's interesting. And so I picked it up, and I open it up, and there's an entire chapter on breathing exercises, pranayama. So here I go in one day from never having heard of something to Ram Dass telling me, be open to it, to there it is in my hand. And so I bought it. And so I took it home, and I just started doing the exercises all the way through. I remember it was a Saturday afternoon, and my wife and baby were gone to visit her mother, who lived about maybe 40 miles away. And so I had the place to myself. And I just started doing these exercises right out of the book. I would do one and then flip the page and do another one. So I started about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. By about midnight, and after doing all of these breathing and yoga exercises and chanting and everything like that, I was in touch with that same space that I'd felt when I bashed myself on the ice falling down. And so there it was, there was a whole different way to get there. I had lost about 75 pounds, so I was sort of, I could feel what could happen, if this actually came true, if the dream really came true. And this friend of mine that I'd known years before showed up for a visit. And he and I were both sort of eating buddies, in those days. We would go out for an ice cream sundae or something. We worked at the same place, and we were both obese. And he was still, a 300-pounder, and I'd gotten down to a real slim 225 or something like that, And so he looked at me. I remember I opened the door, and he looked at me, and he said, God, what are you doing, and what happened to you? And I tried to explain this thing that I was going through. And I remember the way he looked at me. And it's probably it's probably like a lot of people when they start some kind of a change process, the people that are in their lives sort of don't know how to relate to it. And so what he did, this was so bizarre, he went into town and he brought back a 5-pound box of chocolate caramels, which was like the ultimate bad food for me, during that time, And but it was like he walked in the door, and he was a practical joker. I mean, this was partly a practical joke, but I could see the sort of mean edge to it, of kind of wanting to sabotage and wanting to kind of get me to be the way I was. And I realized if I was going to have to, then I didn't have any way to relate to him. And so I basically had to throw him out of my house, leave, please leave. And he did. And what an amazing... 6 months later, I got a call from a friend of mine and said, are you sitting down? I said, yeah. And he said, Ken died. He had a heart attack and died. And he was 26 years old, you know, which was, I mean, and I saw in that moment how that was me. So that was a wake-up moment for me, and a way of saying, life has very serious consequences, you know, choices have very serious consequences. After that year, I moved to California for a few years and went to graduate school. And so over the next few years, I pretty much felt good all the time. And I could see well, and, you know, my weight stabilized and all of that. And I hadn't ever worked out the whole relationship aspect of life. And I continued to have kind of one relationship after the other of, you know, they'd get to a certain point and then they would fall apart. I would usually start finding fault with the person, or the other person would find fault with me, and we'd never be able to work beyond a certain point with our relationship. And so one magic day, I remember setting the intention of, oh, I learned how to see, I learned how to be an okay weight, I learned how to live healthy, free of addictions, I learned how to eat well. How come it didn't occur to me that I could do that with loving? You know, it had never occurred to me that I could actually design my own life around love and relationships. And so that was a big revelation to me, the idea that the same process could work. And so I began to work with this idea of enjoying a flow of love in my life, and that love comes to me. I don't have to pursue it. And as I began to work with that, I had this other amazing insight. In fact, I was walking down the street in San Francisco, I remember in downtown San Francisco, with a woman that I'd been with for a year or so, and we always had the same complaint with each other. Her complaint about me was that I was not in touch with my feelings, and that I never communicated about anything important, that I never would talk about the real stuff, you know. And I, of course, had my defenses against that, you know, that I forget what they were, but I had my good justification for why I didn't talk about my feelings and didn't talk about things that were important. My complaint about her was that she was super critical. And so whenever she would get going with me about, we never talk about anything important, or you're never in touch with your feelings, I would say, well, I would be if you weren't so darn critical, you know, and it would get us into this loop then. And I was walking down the street with her in San Francisco, and I realized, I don't know where this insight came from, but I suddenly realized that, oh, I create that. I'm the one that creates and has created my life so that I'm in relationship with a very critical person. And up until that moment, I thought it was their problem, that I just happened to have the bad luck of always ending up with a critical woman. And so I remember stopping on the street kind of to think about this, and she said, what's going on? And I was kind of trying to share this insight with her. And she wasn't having any part of it, by the way. She was not buying my little insight at all. And so the other awareness that I had in that moment was that the very thing that I complained about all the time, and this is true for everybody, I think, that the very thing we complain about over and over is the very thing that we're creating happening. In other words, we got this loop going of not realizing that we draw certain experiences into our life and then going around complaining about that all the time. So anything you complain about repetitively is something that you have an unconscious intention to produce. And so that hit me like a ton of bricks. I suddenly realized, oh, I require a critical woman in my life. That's me dreaming up that dream. And my next thought was, well, I think I'll dream up a better dream. You know, I'll dream up a dream of being surrounded by loving and supportive people. And that was really a big moment for me, because nobody in the history of my family that I know of has ever had a successful relationship. besides me and Katie. In other words, up until that moment, my parents had a disastrous relationship. My grandparents, just about everybody, everywhere I looked in the family, was full of people who either they had a very kind of like a routine relationship, they went through the roles, certain roles, or they managed to stay in a long-term relationship through the regular application of vodka and other kinds of things that allowed them to stay put, you know. I realized that it would be breaking absolutely radical new ground if I was able to create a relationship that worked, that would be an unthinkable thing to do. And what better thing to make happen, you know, than something completely unthinkable. And so I sat down on the floor of my apartment at the time and designed what I wanted in a close relationship in my mind. And honesty, a relationship where both of us were free to pursue our creativity, our creative callings, and that each of us took full responsibility for our lives so that we didn't get into blaming each other. So if something came up, we would just say, why did I create that, you know? And so I remember saying to the universe at the time, that's what I want, and if it's not in the cards for me to have that, I'll be alone. I'm fine with being alone, but I promise I will never settle for less. And I think that little thing I said at the end kind of cracked the whip, you know. I said, that's what I'm about here. And so from that moment, it only took a month until Katie came into my life. And one of the great moments of my life was my first meeting with her, because she came up to me to ask me a question. I was actually giving a seminar at the graduate school where she was getting her PhD, and she was also one of the instructors there at the school. She was the movement therapy instructor and taught some of the classes there, and she was also getting her PhD. And so she came up to ask me a question during this seminar I was giving. I don't remember what the question is to this day, but I said to her, I'm very attracted to you. I just want to let you know that. And I said, but I also want to let you know that I'm only interested in relationships where both people speak honestly to each other, and both people take responsibility for their lives, and both people are committed to their creativity. And on those terms, would you like to have a cup of coffee with me? And it was kind of I'd never said anything like that in my life. You know, it was a totally outrageous thing to say, especially given the context of what was going on. And so I remember the look on her face. She kind of went like this. You know, it's like cogitate, cogitate, compute, compute, does not compute. And suddenly she said, okay. And I can do that. And so, you know, that was our first meeting and basically set the tone for our whole last 27 years together.
I am rolling. You rolling over there?
Yes.
Well, when I was 12, I knew I wanted to be a doctor and a scientist. I was brought to Boston to essentially have my spine completely fused. And I remember looking up saying, I'm going to be a doctor and a scientist someday. And so I became pre-med at a very early age. But it's interesting, after you farm your intellect for so long, then your body, your spirit throws you an illness to force you to cultivate a part of your body, your brain that you're not using, in your mind. And so after, you know, working as pre-med, I started falling asleep a lot, up to 17 hours a day. And this is kind of a difficult problem. I'll give you an example. Everyone say, I fall asleep during movies, and I fall asleep during class. Well, have you ever fallen asleep running and gotten run over by a truck because you fell asleep? And I actually was. So there was all kinds of falling asleep stories, and this wasn't funny. And this was making it hard for me, you know, to finish Brown and graduate from medical school. And so they gave me a medicine, and what modern medicine got me only so far. It was great. It bought me 2 years, and I was able to finish Brown from a 2.2 average to a 4.0. So it was like, I'm healed, praise the Lord. Well then, like modern medicine can only take you so far. And the medicine started knocking out my bone marrow, and there wasn't another medicine that would help. And so I was forced to look for other things that most people don't want. So I remember going to a medical intuitive, and I thought she was a nut, which is, of course, what I've been becoming. And she told me that my brain freezes up, and it was related to intuition. And I thought, well, how do I fix this freezing up thing, which is falling asleep? She said, I don't know. So you're going to love that. So I went to a bookstore in Boston, and I walked in. It was Trident Bookstore. I don't know if it's still there. And I just was sitting, because I used to, well, actually not sitting, standing. I'd stand a lot because of thinking I wouldn't fall asleep. And I look up at the shelf, and there's this book called You Can Heal Your Life by Louise Hay. So I figured the medical intuitive's not going to help me. I figure out maybe this woman named Louise Hay. And her hair was yellow, so. And so I took the book home, and you have to understand I was really athletic. I used to stay awake. I'd run 5 miles. I'd do reps. And, there were these things called affirmations that if you did them, you're supposed to get, you can heal your life, was the whole point. So I figured, I'll give it a try. I didn't have much else going for me at the time. Plus, student loans were coming due, and I had no other options. I actually could not afford not to go to medical school. So I did reps, just like you do in a gym. Instead of lifting barbells or whatever I love myself just the way I am, 10 times. And after 3 months, I stopped falling asleep, and I was able to go to medical school, which was absolutely lovely. And so I was going to throw away this intuition, throw away this affirmation stuff, because it was something that I needed to get to be kind of normal. But it didn't work. I got to my sophomore year, and I started really hitting the wall. I was doing an MD and a PhD, as anyone would overcompensate who has intuition. So I started blowing discs and stuff, and I couldn't end up going in the intellectual career that I wanted to, being a neurosurgeon, because you can't stand up. So I chose psychiatry because I could sit down, and I hated it. It was boring. But I learned, it's very interesting. All roads lead back to spirituality and intuition, no matter how brainy you want to become. Because the only part of psychiatry that I really liked was cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectic behavioral therapy, which is fascinating. You look at these books by Beck, all these fathers of cognitive behavioral therapy, and you open them up. And the rewiring patterns that they give for obsessive compulsive personality disorder, or, selfishness of narcissistic personality, or all these, or even just normal people who are a little messed up, was I love myself just the way I am. It was just really remarkable. So you understand that what I learned in psychiatry, if I taught a patient to do this, I could bill Blue Cross and get paid. Or the patient could get the same treatment in You Can Heal Your Life by Louise Hay. So in my PhD, and in my psychiatric residency, and I'm now a neuropsychiatrist and I work in the field of intuition, I learned the biochemistry of how someone rewires their thought patterns from I get one health problem after another to I love myself just the way I am completely lovable. We now know that we can rewire our patterns in our brain with cognitive behavioral therapy or affirmations. It changes the way our brains are wired, and they light up differently. So it's not just this fluff, woo-woo stuff with purple, but it really has biochemical, neurochemical, neuropharmacological effects just as effective, if not more effective, than Prozac, Zoloft, whatever else you have. So as far as I'm concerned, Louise Hay, former model, former therapist, writes this little book, this little blue book, and lo and behold, she discovers something by observation that science supports decades later. And we now can see how it works, at least from a biochemical point of view, on a functional MRI and PET scan. So I would be forever indebted to Louise Hay, what she did to me personally, because she woke me up, and literally what she has done as a revolutionary for, from my perspective, modern medicine. People have been getting hunches, intuition, seeing things, clairvoyance, hearing things, clairaudience, feeling things, clairsentience for years. And the thing is, if you look at everyone, you look at an audience, you look at people in a bus station, everyone's wired differently. But everybody's got a part of them, it's with a Boston accent, that's not right. A part of them that makes them unique, stands out from the crowd. And that part of you that's not right, that's different, that's a black sheep, that's the part of you, the window of opportunity for intuition. So for me, I've always been not right. My parents sent me to get evaluated when I was 5 because they said something was wrong with her. And though I passed and I got straight A's in all these classes, I clearly used to get bad conduct marks for, especially in the second grade. The teacher said, finish his class early, but clearly is distracted, is really interested in what's going on with everybody else in the room. When I was in the 8th grade, a teacher who probably had PMS looked at me sideways and I started to cry. And of course, they took me to the guidance office because they're supposed to give you guidance, which is supposed to get you out of your right hemisphere of emotion and put you cleanly and neatly and hermetically sealed in your left brain intellect. And he said, you're never going to get through life with this